It's Sunday, June 29th, 2025. We have a pretty large risk of severe weather out here stretching from the central plains all the way up into the Midwest with a focus on our Midwest sector up here near Wisconsin and Iowa. We actually have a slight risk of severe weather in this region, and then our marginal risk extends all the way back into the central and even parts of the southern plains. Then we have one marginal risk out here in the mid-Atlantic. Then, of course, we're expecting pretty widespread scattered thunderstorms across the day across the United States. It's going to basically entirely be a wind threat with a 15% slight chance of severe winds up here stretching from Iowa into Wisconsin, then a associated 5% risk of severe winds stretching all the way back into parts of the central upper plains and parts of the lower plains. I actually expect that this risk will be upgraded for much of this area. Then our hail risk is going to be a pretty small but long 5% risk of hail stretching all the way from the central upper plains into the Midwest. I also wouldn't be surprised to see this risk upgraded in parts like up here near Wisconsin and really anywhere along this 5% risk. And then although the SPC hasn't really outlined a tornado threat, I wouldn't be surprised to see a couple of spin up tornadoes along the line of storms that we're going to have. So definitely, I think tornadoes are still going to be a possibility. Here is our simulated reflectivity from the central plains and up into parts of the Midwest. And we're going to have a very interesting storm evolution. And it's all going to start with this line of storms and this powerful line of storms back here in South Dakota. Now, what this guy is going to do, he's going to lay out an outflow boundary for the storm. And this storm is going to kind of latch onto that outflow boundary. And it's pretty much going to ride this outflow boundary all the way into parts of Minnesota and northern Iowa. And in the early morning hours on Sunday, it could produce some really strong winds. I'm talking 80 to 90 mile an hour gust. And also there could be a increased tornado potential of spin up tornadoes along this line back here with parts of the line that can kind of cling on to that outflow boundary. So now we're going to watch it kind of unfold. And right there, that storm grabs onto that outflow boundary around early morning Sunday. And this is probably around sunrise where the low level jet could also kick in, also fueling these storms even more. And we actually see some wake left behind this storm. And then it looks like there's actually going to be kind of a bookend vortex, which will be left behind from this strong line of storms back here, which could initiate a couple of storms back here in parts of northeastern Wyoming and western South Dakota, but they're not expected to be super strong with the ingredients present. So while this line is bringing potentially some small hail, very strong winds, and a couple of spin up tornadoes, it's also laying an outflow boundary out across this region, which is going to increase convergence in our high plains convergence zone and also leave pretty much effectively a cold front across this region. And probably it will even bring a low to this region down here in southeastern Colorado, and that will probably move into Kansas, and that will be another reason for storms later in the day. So a little after the morning hours, it looks like our line is going to kind of fall apart. By midday, it's going to be pretty much gone with a small cluster remaining back here in parts of southern to central Iowa, which could still have severe characteristics. And then moving into the early to mid-afternoon, we start seeing some redevelopment along that boundary or kind of cold front or outflow boundary left behind by that storm. And we also see storm activity up in our upper plains convergence zone, which is also going to be associated with convergence increased by the outflow boundary. And we also see a bit of a development of a low pressure system back here that we talked about as well. And of course, there's also going to be that little pretty discrete storm left behind initiated by what potentially looks like a bit of a bookend vortex. And although the ingredients up here aren't going to be super prevalent, this is a somewhat discrete storm, so it could possibly bring the threat of a more organized risk. But anyways, moving a bit later in the day, there's going to be ample moisture up here in our upper plains convergence zone, so definitely a couple of severe storms up here possible. And then along this line from our outflow boundary, we're going to see a pretty strong redevelopment around late afternoon to the sunset hours. So there's going to be storms down here in parts of Kansas and Nebraska that have increased severe characteristics from that low. Then up here in parts of eastern Nebraska and into Iowa, there's going to be another cluster. And the storms will only kind of strengthen and probably reach their peak around when that low level jet kicks in. And at this time, they'll be producing pretty much entirely a threat of strong severe winds, some small hail, and possibly a couple of spin up tornadoes, although our shear vectors are kind of pointing straight into the storms, which could limit that risk. But that risk is definitely not zero to see a couple of spin up tornadoes tomorrow. And then pushing into the night hours, we'll see a bit of a mesoscale convective system kind of develop out here, and this is going to push into parts of northwestern Missouri and across the state, and that will likely bring a lot of wind and some severe winds. Here's a look from up here in parts of Wisconsin and eastern Iowa, and we can see here's our line of storms from Saturday and Sunday morning pushing into the region, and we're going to see a couple of disorganized storms up here near midday, but they'll likely fall apart because there's going to be a lot of stable air in this region, although this is probably the region where our bulk shear is going to be the most conducive for organized storms. But the main round of storms is going to come into late afternoon, and we're actually going to see a couple of storms with a more discrete nature, and that's going to be because of the capping up here. And if these storms can organize, they could definitely pose the threat of all hazards of severe weather because they'll be along that boundary, and there could be a couple of pockets of vorticity along that boundary, and because they'll have that more discrete nature. Even though this storm looks like kind of a storm cluster with a bit of a bow, I definitely could see all hazards of severe weather. So possibly a tornado, strong winds, and then maybe some hail up here in parts of Wisconsin. And it looks like this storm will kind of continue to stay in a cluster, and then it'll move out of the state by the early night hours and pretty much be gone. Our last area of interest is going to be out here in the mid-Atlantic. And what we're going to notice is that there's not going to be a lot of activity up here because there's actually going to be a front out here which these storms could probably interact with. And that is one of the reasons why they're expected to possibly be stronger. But this story out here is nothing that we haven't seen before. It's a lot of moisture, some instability, and storms interacting with a front. And the storms out here in this region will have a increased microburst potential. So strong temporary winds created by kind of a temporary downdraft in the storm. And then we just see a lot of scattered convection like we have the past couple of days, just initiated by peak heating. If some of these storms could cluster, they could possibly become strong or severe, but it's not super likely, and it would probably only be a very isolated risk if that were to happen. Here are 500 millibar winds, and we can see that we actually see a bit of a short wave moving through, which is going to help to kind of keep that line of storms in the morning moving along. And then what's going to happen is that that same short wave is going to push into parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin as we go later into the day when storms are expected to fire, and that could help initiate storms up here in Wisconsin. Actually, here it is, and then we just have a decent bit of flow back here which could help to initiate a couple of storms, but it's not super likely. If we did, we'd possibly only see a couple of isolated storms out here in this region because it will already have been stabilized by that line of storms the night prior. And then of course there's going to be frontal activity with our main line down here, and then we possibly see a little shortwave moving into our risk area up here in the mid-Atlantic, but it doesn't look super strong. But that is another reason why those storms up there could be initiating. And our 700 millibar winds for the same day, we're going to see quite a bit of our 700 millibar winds pumping into what will be that line of storms Sunday morning, possibly kind of keeping it going or strengthening it. And then as we move further into the day, we'll see a pretty prevalent area of 700 millibar winds up in Wisconsin. So if any storms can develop around here and have that sort of discrete nature, which is possible up in this region, or even if they're just clustered, they could possibly become stronger as well. Then there's also going to be a bit of 700 millibar flow right here where we think our most prevalent cluster is going to be, which could also help to strengthen those storms as well. Here is a weather sounding from Wisconsin, and we can see that our hodograph isn't really going to be super indicative of a certain type of severe weather. Our low level helicity is going to be pretty low, and our low level shear is going to be pretty low, but there could be pockets of increased gradients along that boundary, which the storms in Wisconsin will be along. Our bulk shear is going to be pretty much at that 40 knot threshold at 49 knots, which will help to spin and strengthen those updrafts as well to organize those storms. We see some very weak wind veering, which could also mean less organized storms, but our bulk shear is going to be prevalent, so that probably shouldn't be an issue with storms in Wisconsin. Our lowest cloud level, it would be low enough to support a tornado threat. And then our mid-level lapse rates are going to be 8.1 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, and we're going to have a decent bit of CAPE up here near our freezing level. So that's one of the reasons for that conditional hail risk. I actually think the hail risk will probably be the highest in Wisconsin with the bulk shear and then coupled with the mid-level lapse rates in Cape near the freezing layer. We do see some dry air aloft, which could help to support that risk of severe winds. We also see definitely enough moisture for this region, a 72 dew point, which would also help to support all hazards of severe weather. We see a fairly juiced up air mass nearing 4,000 Cape, and then our precipitable water is going to be 1.64 inches. Then our downdraft Cape is going to be pretty low, so that will limit the risk of severe winds up here in this region. But our 3 Cape will also be somewhat high at 135, which will support that risk of all threats of severe weather. So in summary, I think our risk area in Wisconsin has the greatest probability of producing all threats of severe weather. But I think the main threat up here will be severe winds and some hail, and then possibly a tornado or two. And that threat for tornadoes will maximize when that low level jet kicks in. Here is a weather sounding from where I think our main cluster of storms tomorrow would be in parts of Iowa and eastern Nebraska. And immediately our photograph doesn't look super indicative of any certain types of severe weather. Our low level helicity is going to be pretty low. Our low level shear is going to be pretty low. And our bulk shear is actually going to be pretty low. But because these storms are going to be along that front and probably a spinning low, that should help to organize them and keep them sustained. Our lowest cloud level is going to be low enough to support a spin up tornado threat. Then our veering of our winds, and our winds in general are just going to be pretty weak, which could kind of hinder storm organization. We do see some Cape near our freezing layer, and our mid-level lapse rates definitely aren't poor at 7.8 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. But because it's going to be mostly a linear storm mode, that threat of hail is probably decreased, but there's definitely still the threat of hail in this region. We see a very moist environment at a 77 dew point, which would be conducive for all threats of severe weather. We also see a teeny bit of dry air aloft, then even more dry air aloft, which would likely help to support that threat of severe winds. We see a incredibly juiced up atmosphere nearing 6,000 joules per kilogram of Cape, so that's extremely unstable. Our precipitable water is going to be 1.83 inches. And our downdraft Cape is going to be nearing 1,500. So another reason why that threat of severe winds could be realized out here in possibly a big way. Then our 3 Cape is going to be surpassing 200. So whenever that happens, definitely all hazards of severe weather are possible. So in summary, in this cluster of storms in parts of eastern Iowa. This cluster of storms in parts of western Iowa and eastern Nebraska is likely going to be probably a decently large wind risk. The threat for some small hail and then possibly a spin up tornado could also be realized. And then this is a weather sounding from near our Kansas area, near that spinning low, where I think another cluster of storms could possibly become strong. Our photograph doesn't look super indicative of anything super special. Our low level helicity is going to be pretty low. Our low level shear is going to be pretty low. And our bulk shear is going to be pretty low. But I think it will be kind of the same story as our cluster storms up in parts of eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, where that spinning low and boundary will help to kind of keep them going. We have some interesting wind vectors, probably a little bit of veering in our winds. It looks pretty weak though, so that could be also an issue with storm organization. We see some Cape up here near our freezing layer, and our mid-level lapse rates are going to be 8.7 Celsius decreasing per kilometer. So a reason why some small hail could be out here in this risk area. Our lowest cloud level is going to be pretty high, which is indicative of a strong wind threat. We also see some somewhat moist air for this region, a 63 dew point. So that could help to support that threat for severe winds. We do have some dry air aloft, which could also help to support that threat for severe winds. And our environment out here isn't going to be as unstable as some areas, but it's still going to be nearing 3,000 Cape. So definitely enough for storms. Our precipitable water is going to be 1.61 inches. Our downdraft Cape is going to be over 1,800. So another reason why severe winds could be possible. And then something interesting is that our relative humidity in lower parts of the atmosphere is going to be pretty low at only 36%, which could help to increase that evaporative cooling and possibly make that threat for severe winds realized as well. So out here in Kansas, I think the main threat with these storms is going to be almost entirely a severe wind threat with the possibility of some very small hail. And I think the tornadoes out here are going to pretty much not really be possible with our lowest cloud level being super high. But, never say never when storms are on boundaries. There could be the threat of possibly a spin up tornado. I just don't really think that's going to happen at all out here in Kansas. And our last risk area from our mid-Atlantic, I'm not going to spend loads of time on it, but most importantly, we have a moist environment, a fairly unstable environment, seeing 3,000 Cape. Then our precipitable water is going to be 2.2 inches. So a reason for that microburst risk. And our 3 cape is also going to be over 134. So possibly some microburst and severe winds out here in the mid-Atlantic tomorrow. And our lowest cloud level is going to be pretty low, and these storms are going to be interacting with the boundary. So the tornado threat out here is going to be super duper slim, but it's also not impossible to maybe see a tornado associated with these storms.